of course, everyone can drop in at any time. Well, we can start with the basics now. Good morning. My name is Kelly Cannon Miller. I'm the Executive Director for the Deschutes County Historical Society, and we operate the Deschutes Historical Museum. And one of the things that we do, like in the top 10 things that we do as a historical society on a really regular basis, is to answer people's research questions about their property, or people doing genealogy. They're tracking their family history and they know that grandpa homesteaded in a certain place, and can we help them find that? And as the pandemic has gone on for a year now, we've found that a lot of people are at home doing more research. And so our info at requests went way up during the last year. And we thought, well, you know what, we can show everybody that there's lots of things that they can do from home online to do this kind of search, and empower you all to be able to do that while you're at home, maybe. So I'm going to introduce you to Vanessa Ivy. She is our museum manager. So as all of those info at requests come in, Vanessa is who processes them. And sometimes she answers them. Sometimes she's assigning them to our volunteer crew to compile information for folks for us to be able to get back to them. She has been doing this with us for 10 years now, and is just a great person to learn from. So I'm going to man the Q&A and the chat while Vanessa runs through our first of 3 sessions. Today, we're going to do some history and what this system looks like, so that as you're diving into it, you know what you're looking at. So take it away, Vanessa.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everybody. One of the great things about doing this on Zoom and having snow outside is we don't have to cancel. Everybody can still show up. So thank you for joining us today. You should have all received a handout I emailed to you, our 2021 property search research list, and it has a lot of information on it. We are only going to be looking at a few of those sites, but those are all sites that I use when I'm doing either rural property searches or even residential searches. So hopefully, as you guys get into this and start experimenting and playing around on the internet at different sites, you'll see how those work for you. Excuse me. I also want to mention that at the end of this series, Kelly and I will be drawing a name of those participating, and the winner will receive 2 additional hours of one-on-one time with me. So hopefully that'll keep you engaged till the very end. And moving the slide along. There we go. So before we get started, I just want to share a few tips of getting organized, because I think this is really important. You're going to be inundated with a lot of information, not necessarily from this program, but also as you start collecting information. And it's really important to keep it organized. I am not always as organized as I would like to be. So these are all things that I try to follow. So the first thing is, don't trust details to memory. I have a lot of stuff in my head. And if I tried to keep everything that I was reading and learning, it would be a jumble. And so I have to write it down. And I like to use the composition, the old school composition notebooks, and I use these a lot. And I also tend to use scrap pieces of paper, which is not a good thing. The best thing with the scraps is if you have to jot something down because it's right there, just remember to transfer that information into wherever it is you're keeping your notes. And that brings us to our second, where it's keep your notes all in the same place. I usually am doing multiple properties. So I have 3-ring binders that I use for each of the different properties. And that way I don't have to be going through one 3-ring binder to find different properties. I can just go to the one binder, pull it out. I know this is for OB Riley, or this is for Mears, or whatever property I'm working on. Write down where you find the information. What are the resources that you're using? Where did you find it? Did you find that in a book? Was it off of a website? Was it the newspaper? Was it from grandma or an uncle? Make sure that you document where you're collecting your information. And especially if it's letters or oral history sort of documentation, make sure, see if you can verify it. And you can do this in a number of ways. You can ask another family member if they remember that incident, or have them tell you what they remember and know. Another way to do it is search the newspaper. Sometimes you'll find verification of an event that they may have participated in through the newspaper. So document and try and verify. And then be consistent. However your code or your abbreviations that you're using, do it consistently. So for instance, I tend to get a lot of stuff off the internet via newspaper sites. And so if it's a clipping that I've done, I generally start off with the year, then the date and the day and the page number. And then I have abbreviations for the newspapers. So for instance, BB would be Bend Bulletin, or CCJ would be the Crook County Journal, so that I know where I got that information from. So I can always go back to it if I need to do that. So throughout this webinar series, I'm going to share ways I research rural properties and homesteads. And certainly it is not the definitive of this. There are all different kinds of ways. I'm still learning. I'm learning things all the time from other people. So this is just how I do it. And that's what I'm sharing with you today. However, I want to remind all of us that the lands that we're going to be referencing were not originally unoccupied land that the federal government was giving away. The land was already occupied. People were already living on these lands. These were Native American people, and it was their sovereign land. The Homestead Act made it possible for many disenfranchised people to own land, including single women, freed slaves, immigrants. But one group was left out. They were banned. The Native American people were not allowed to file land claims. The federal government did not see them as people, as they had no standing in the law. It would be not until 1862 that the federal government changed this policy, allowing Native people to file land claims. However, the federal government required that they give up their Native citizenship. And upon renouncing their heritage, only then did the federal government see them as people. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of these places. And in remembering them, we honor their legacies, their lives, and their descendants. We're very lucky to live in a county, Deschutes County, that has placed a lot of this information free and accessible on the internet, because that is not the case in many places outside of this area, as well as outside of the state. And so we can do a lot of the research from home because of the digitization that has occurred within both the city and the county. So I'm hoping that the skills and the tools and the examples that I share with you, you'll be able to then take and apply elsewhere. And although it might take you a little longer and you have to have some patience, in the end, the treasures that you find are really rewarding and are really awesome, because this does work outside of Deschutes County, and I'm going to use examples to show you that it does work. The General Land Office, or the GLO, was established in 1812 as an independent agency in the federal government's Department of Treasury. It was created to support the government's goals of expanding to the West, and was responsible in the surveying and the sales of the public domain properties that the U.S. acquired, either through colonial states, land through signed treaties, or foreign powers. In 1843, with the release of John Fremont's maps and notes, people were arriving in increased numbers into Oregon Territory. And at that time, Oregon Territory would have consisted of Washington, Oregon, and parts of Idaho. In 1849, the GLO was transferred to the Department of Interior. And in 1851, even though Oregon was not yet a state, we received our first Surveyor General of Oregon, John Preston, and opened up our first GLO survey office in Oregon City. Now, 1859 is when we became a state. And in fact, tomorrow will be Oregon's birthday, February 14th. In 1946, GLO, which was created in 1812, and the U.S. Grazing Services, which was formed in 1934, merged into the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM. And again, we're celebrating their 75th anniversary this year in July. In 1971, Oregon Land Office merged with BLM, Oregon, Washington State Office. Now, acting under a number of public land laws, including the Homestead Act of 1862, GLO eventually oversaw nearly 33 million acres of public domain land in Oregon alone, passing these lands from federal government over to the settlers. So now you understand a little bit of history of the GLO, but you've headed west, the land is opened up, the government wants us over here. And so what do? So you've arrived and now you're staking your claims. The Donation Land Act and the two others on here, Sales Cash Entry Act and the Homestead Act, are the three that we generally see the most of when doing research. And so those are the three I'm going to just define and focus on. However, there are many more. There's Mineral Right Land Acts. There's all kinds of ones out there. And there's also variations where these were amended. So I'm just going to look at the basics here, and that will help when you're see Donation Land Act or Sales Cash Entry Act. You'll understand a little bit more about what that meant. So the Donation Land Act of 1850, basically the government wanted people to head west, because that meant that if citizens were claiming land in areas that weren't necessarily designated United States, then the United States could claim that land. So they offered 320 acres of free land per person. If you were married, your wife and the husband each got 320 acres of land. They had to actually cultivate it. That was a requirement. They had to live on it for 4 consecutive years in order to claim, and they had to claim the certification. Let's see if I can. They had to live on that land for 4 years consecutively before they could actually apply for certification and the deed for the property. This particular Land Act was available between 1850 and 1855, and approximately 25,000 to 30,000 settlers arrived in Oregon before the expiration of the act. So you can see a lot of people were heading west just into the Oregon country to get land. And the cool thing about this Land Act was that it was the first federal legislation to grant women property in their own right. They didn't have to be married. It didn't have to be signed under their husband's name or a man's name. They could actually do it on their own and have their own property. And so you did see a lot of women heading west. Now, the Sales Cash Entry Act, these were smaller, isolated tracts of land. They were generally next to the Donation Land Acts. They were offered at public auction. So these were properties that were maxed out at 160 acres, but most of the time you saw them much smaller. What wasn't sold at auction was then offered kind of on the open market for $1.25 an acre. And some people around in the Deschutes County area that took advantage of this would be Anne Markle and her sisters Gertrude and Nellie, who came from Illinois for adventure out to Oregon. Annie was one of the local school teachers here and went on to marry Forbes, who was the first Republican representative for Central Oregon in the Oregon House. Grace Jones and her mother Cora Jones came out and bought property under this act. Grace was also a school teacher, and she went on to marry the first mayor of Bend, Arthur Goodwillie. E. Riley was Obie Riley's mother. You might be familiar with the Riley Ranch. So Riley's mother was the first manager of the Pilot Butte Inn. And of course, Ruth Reed, Reed School, the building that the Historical Society is housed in and home to the Historical Museum. She was one of the earliest teachers here in Bend, and she was the first principal of Bend schools, and she purchased. 1862 is the one you're going to see the most of. This was applicable to all of the public domain sites, not just Oregon and Washington, but all of the public domain states. And it no longer was an outright gift from the federal government. You had to pay something. So you might have paid a filing fee and then lived on the property for a consecutive number of years, or you purchased it right out. You had to improve the property, you had to cultivate it, construct buildings, basically proving up. Now, a lot of times we think of homesteads as something that happened in the early 1800s through the early 1900s. And in fact, the first settler to make a claim under the Homestead Act was Daniel Friedman, a Civil War veteran, and he did this in January of 1863. But the last homesteader to have property under the Homestead Act was actually Kenneth Deerdorf, who was a Vietnam veteran, and he filed for 80 acres in Alaska in 1974. He fulfilled the requirements in 1979, and he received his patent in 1988. The Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976 had repealed the Homestead Act, but allowed Alaska to have a 10-year extension. And so that's how he was able to file. And in June of 2001, BLM and National Park Services partnered together to recognize Deerdorf as the nation's final homesteader. Now, he's no longer living on the property, but apparently the home still is standing and is still there, according to the National Parks website. 2 million individuals used the Homestead Act in order to obtain property. 270 to 285 million acres of land was settled, and that's roughly 8 to 10% of all the land in the United States. Now, under the Homestead Act, you had two options. You paid an $18 filing fee. You had to be 21 years of age. The head of the household received 160 acres, and your wife could also receive another 160 acres. You had to build a house on the property. You had to make improvements to the land. It had to be better than when you received it. Basically, you're proving up. And you had to live on the land for 5 consecutive years. Once all of these requirements had been met, you could then file a land entry case file. Basically, it's a proof document that you had fulfilled all the requirements. You then, basically what that was is a multi-page survey, and it asks questions like, what did you plant the first year? How many crops and how many acres of crops did you plant the second year, and so forth for 5 years? Did you ever leave the property? If so, how many years or how long had you left the property? Did you come back to the property? So there was a number of questions that were asked on this survey document. You also had to have 2 witnesses. So they could have been neighbors, they could have been friends who could vouch for you that you had stayed on the property and fulfilled the requirements. And they basically filled out the same questionnaire. All of that would have gotten sent into the general land office, and you would have sent in a filing fee for $6. And then ideally, it would have been reviewed and your patent sent to you to say, now you've succeeded in fulfilling these requirements, the land is yours. Unfortunately, the GLO actually was inundated with so many requests and proof documents that many times you didn't get yours right away, that was delayed. So sometimes when you are looking at dates of when the patent was completed or filed, you'll see, oh, well, it looks like 7 years and not 5 years. And that's because it just took time for the settler to receive their patent. The other option that you could do is just buy it outright. And so after 6 months of proving up, you just paid $1.25 an acre for the property and it was yours. And so, but there weren't very many people that used option 2. You're usually seeing most of the people, settlers, using option 1. If the homesteader gave up and left the property for an extended amount of time before they had completed the 5 years, the land was then reverted back to the government and was then offered to the public again for someone else to buy. So you hear me using acre a lot. And what does that mean? I'm a very visual person. So it helps me when I'm doing my research understand how large an acre actually is. And an acre is actually described as a measure of land, 160 square rods, which you can see a rod is 4 rods is equal to 66 feet. It's a measure. And the British, actually, it's a medieval term regarding the amount of land that could be plowed in one day by one ox. So the best way to kind of visualize this is think of a football field. We just had the Super Bowl. Think of the football field, and an acre is just a little bit smaller than the football field. So when we're talking about 160 acres, imagine 160 football fields lined up right next to each other, and that's the amount of property. Then this is the hardest part of homesteading research, is deciphering the code. The code is the address. It's the public land survey system address. So using township, range, section, and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller into parcels. And visualizing how this looks for me has taken a long time. The Public Land Service System was created in 1785, and not every state in the United States uses it. In fact, 24 states use a different version called meets and bounds. And some of those 24 states use part or a hybrid version of the public land survey system. And that includes most of the East Coast, Texas, and Hawaii. So I have included in the handout that I sent a little bit of a visualization like what you're seeing on this slide to help you with this. The Public Land Survey System it defines property locations for deed and grants, so kind of creates that address. It begins at an initial point called the principal meridian line. You'll see in the middle of this slide the circle right here. This is the one that you would find just outside of Portland. That's the Willamette meridian point that all properties in Washington and Oregon use to measure out from. There are 37 principal meridian lines in the United States. Some states, like Oregon and Washington, have one that in this case they share, the Willamette meridian, but other states like Oklahoma have two. One is called the Cimarron and the other is called the Indian line. Oregon and Washington, like I said, share the Willamette meridian. Township, often denoted as the letter T, capital T, is a measurement of distance north and south from that initial point, and it's divided into increments of 6 miles. Range is a measurement of the distance also from that initial point, but running east and west, also in increments of 6 miles. And a section is 1 square mile area, which contains 640 acres. And there are 36 sections in one township square. So what does all of that mean? So here is your meridian line, the Willamette. The point that we would be measuring from would be right here. This is our baseline or the range. And this dot represents Deschutes County. So if we look at Deschutes County closer, you can see that it's made up of all these little squares. These squares are called township squares, and they are made up of 36 1-mile squares. So you basically have 6 miles and 6 miles. And here's these squares that are 1 through 36. And each one of these is 1 mile by 1 mile. So you can see over here, 1 mile by 1 mile. These sections are then divided into quarters and halves. So, and it usually runs like A, B, C, D, or 1, 2, 3, 4. For me to help visualize this, it's easier for me to think of a mathematical X, Y coordinate graph. So if the base meridian is X and the principal meridian or the Willamette line is Y, I'm going to use the OB Ranch address as an example here. So they're actually located in section 18, township 17 south, range 12 east from the Willamette meridian. So we're going to ignore section 18 for right now. But so township 17 south. So if I was, it's south because it's south of the initial point here. If I was to go down 17 times 16, or I'm sorry, 6 mile increment points. So the easiest way to do that is to multiply 6 times 17, which is 102. So I'll go straight down 102 miles here. Then I'm going to go east. I'm going to do figure out my range, which in this case is going to be 12 times 6, because remember, every range point is 6 miles. So I'm going to go 12 times 6, which is 72 miles east, because Bend is east again of this Portland point. And here is my square. And that square would be like 12, or I'm sorry, 36 sections. I know it gets very confusing and it takes some time to wrap your head around, but I promise you it does get easier. So let us go back to, so let's say this is that red square that we just came when we did township and range. And you can see here, there's 36 sections, and each of these sections is a mile by a mile. And what's interesting here is you see that it kind of does this serpentine. It doesn't just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It kind of does this serpentine, which is actually called bostrophodonic, which is a long word meaning the way the ox turns while plowing, which is kind of cool because the definition of acre was how the amount of land a single ox could plow in one day. And so this would have been the ox plowed down one furrow, turned around and plowed down the next furrow, and then so forth. And so that's how you can kind of imagine it. So each of these sections, here's one here, is divided up into quarters: northeast, northwest, southwest, southeast. Sometimes, like I said, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or A, B, C, D. Then each of these quarters are divided into quarters, and each of these quarters are divided into quarters, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you were at the bottom here, it's like 9 south, 5 east, 30 DCB. So what that means is the township 9 south, range 5 east, section number 30. So in this case, here's section number 30, and DCB, and that is the location within the section. So D would be the southeast quarter, A, B, C, D here. C would be within the southeast quarter. It's in the southwest quarter here, A, B, C. And B is defining that it is within the northwest quarter of C. So if you were to read this, like you read the address for the museum, 129 Northwest Idaho Avenue, your rural property would read out northwest quarter of the southwest quarter of the southeast quarter of section 30 of township 9 south, range 5 east. It's a big mouthful. Again, the more you see it and you practice it, and it will become easier to understand. Where do you get this information? Where do you find these addresses of township, range, and section? Well, you're going to find it in a number of different ways. You're going to find it on deeds and patents. A lot of times it's going to be written out. This is Annie Markles, and this says northwest quarter of the southwest quarter of section 30 in township 17 south of range 12 east of the Willamette Meridian, Oregon, containing 3,200 acres. You will find it on the General Land Office records. You can see here where it says 15 south, 10 east, south half of the northeast quarter of section 10 in Deschutes County. You might find it in newspapers. Here's one from for sale, 160 acres on the Ben Burns Road, 35 miles southeast, section 25, township 20, range 16 east. Would consider trade for Seattle property, Elmer Antis. Or you might find it this way. Here's one. It's a transfer of property from H.C. Mears to B.E. Mears. This is actually reads the section, then township, then range. So it would be section 18, township 18, range 2 east. You'll find them on maps. This happens to be the Robert Gould map, who was a surveyor for the area in 1915. This map dates back to 1915, and each of these little squares here are a section. And you can see here, this says township 18, range 8, and then there'll be the big township square divided into 36 squares. The best place, if you're doing your own property, is to look at your tax lot number, because the first 6 numbers is township, range, and section. So this is for the museum. So we're in township 17, range 12, section 32, and C and A is the description of where in that section you can find us. So we'll review this a little bit at the beginning of next week's class. And then next week, we'll actually delve into the General Land Office records to show you how we can use this information to start looking for family member properties. And what's really fun is you may have just a property and then you'll get a name with it, or you might just have a name and now you're going to see where they actually lived. So that'll be next week. So Kelly, did we get any questions?
I have one question for you. Backing up to when we were talking about that it would take a lot of time for all this paperwork to come through the lands office, does that mean that once you get those records, the date that they started proving up, will that show up on the record? Or can that be sometimes deceiving for if you thought you heard that Grandpa homesteaded in 1906 and then you find the paperwork and it lists 1912? Will it show will the paperwork show when he started?
So, okay, so there's two different things we're talking about, or I'm understanding that we're talking about. So the patent that the general land office sends to you will have a date on it that was all signed when the proofing up was over, and they're now issuing you the patent that you own the property outright. So that is a different date than, say, the documents, the survey documents that you were sending in to say, I fulfilled the requirements. So that would be from the time where Grandpa started proving up. So one is the start of proving up. The other is when they got around to where GLO is now getting around to processing your deed, and that will have the date on it there. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yep, it does.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions? You can hit us up in the chat or the Q&A. It's a lot of information to process, lots of little squares. But so far, we seem to have lulled them into silence or overwhelmed them.
So I received a really cool little PowerPoint. Oh, whoops. That helps. Let me see if I can find it here. That might help with the visualization of, oh, that's not what I want. Sorry, bear with me. I'm technically challenged. Okay, so this is a section of land. So in that, whatever that the township might be, this is one of those 36 sections. In this case, it's section 16. And you can see where we have our section corners. And so this is 1 mile, and here's the halfway mile mark. And it's divided into quarters. And so this description equals the southwest quarter that's highlighted. And now you have the southeast quarter of the southwest quarter. And here's the west half of the southeast quarter of the southwest quarter. And so that's how it would read. So I hope that's a little bit easier visually to understand what I was trying to describe. There's also on here, I said there were 24 states that did not use this particular system. They used the meets and bounds system. And what that just meant was you would have your section corner or some other landmark, and the measurement would be from that point. So in this case, it would be like 1,320 feet on the section line to the point of beginning of your property. Then they draw another line from that, and they take another reading from there. Then they take another reading from there, and that would be the description of your property. So you can see how the PLSS is much easier to understand than trying to figure out that meets and bounds, because some of those from the East Coast, you'll get from such and such tree to such and such stone or rock wall. So it's much more descriptive, the meets and bounds. So this format was a lot easier to survey, and especially when you're doing thousands of properties, you can see how that would be much more easier to write up and to process. If you have questions and you just can't think of them now, but as you're starting to do this and you have questions, please feel free to email me and I will do my best to help answer them. So don't feel like you are done with this class and, oh, I have a question. Go ahead, please feel free to email me and I will do my best to answer it.
Great. So the only other question we got is that one of our participants didn't get their handout. So we'll get that resent after we finish up. And as soon as the recording has processed, we'll get you the link sent out so that if you want to go back and review anything, you can. Otherwise, we'll see you guys all next Saturday and we'll get into some nitty gritty. We'll actually go in and do some research. Oh, hang on. A question at the last minute.
Okay.
What is the difference? What is the difference between a land deed and patent?
There's not. As far as I can tell, that it's legal jargon, and I tried to look it up and I haven't found any difference as far as land deed versus patent in this case. Everything I found is that it's similar.
The patent is the deed.
The patent is the deed. Yes.
Okay.
In this particular case, they're interchangeable. That may not be the case all the time. It's legal jargon. So the long and the short
under
is
the homestead.
Under this, it's the same.
Got it. Okay. All right. We'll try this again. Now, if there's no further questions, or you can always email us. Your email is in the handout, correct?
Yes. Well, I sent it from my email, so you would have it.
Yes, correct. So you all have Vanessa's email if you think of a question after we finish. And otherwise, we'll see you all next Saturday. And we'll do some searching and find some stuff.
Yay.
Have a great snowy afternoon, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.